In hearing this gospel over the years, I've always wondered,
Jesus was seeming to be pushing people away, this woman, this enemy, this Canaanite today. This was Jesus said to accept all. Even the apostles were saying, let's get rid of her. She's causing problems to us faithful ones, the house of Israel. So I always wondered about that, and then I came to understand what Jesus was saying that day about the Canaanite woman. A 6-year-old girl went to her friend's house for supper. When everyone was seated at the table, she bowed her head and waited for a prayer. When no one prayed, she smiled sheepishly and said, I see you're like my dog. You start right in. I think my mother said that many times. Jews felt this way about Gentiles. They considered them grossly irreverent when it came to God and religion. And they regarded Gentiles as spiritual dogs. So this brings us to today's gospel reading. Scholars note that the Greek word that Jesus used to refer to the woman is the diminutive form for dogs. That means it refers to lap dogs or pet dogs, not street dogs. In other words, Jesus used the word in an affectionate way, just as we sometimes use the word rascal in an affectionate way. For example, a mother hugs her small son and says, I love you, you little rascal. The Canaanite woman's response to Jesus shows that she understood the word that way too. She said to Jesus, probably with a smile, that even dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the table of their masters. In other words, she said to Jesus, I know your priority must be to Jews, but couldn't you sneak a few crumbs to me, just as little boys do to their pets when their parents aren't looking? And Jesus answered her, saying, O woman, great is your faith. With that, he cured her daughter. The woman's aggressiveness in today's gospel illustrates an important truth about faith, too. It is this: faith is not something passive. It's something active and aggressive. It's not sitting back and waiting for God to act. It's not sitting back and trusting God will act. It's standing up and urging God to act. It's making a nuisance of ourselves, if necessary, to get God to act. Take the woman in today's gospel. She is a perfect picture of a nuisance. To appreciate what a nuisance she was, recall that the Canaanites were the traditional enemies of the Jews. The woman did something no self-respecting Canaanite would ever do. She came to a Jew for help. She did even more. She fell on her knees before that Jew and begged for help. She even got into a friendly argument with Jesus about why he should help her. In other words, today's gospel teaches us that faith involves aggressiveness. It teaches us what the old saying says, God helps those who help themselves. St. Ignatius of Loyola used to say, pray as though everything depends on God, but act and be aggressive as if everything depends on us. That's a good description, I think, of faith today. Let me illustrate what I mean by being aggressive. He stretched out his staff across the Red Sea as God told him to do. The sea didn't divide and open up a path for the people to cross over. That great miracle didn't take place until an old Jewish couple stepped into the sea and started to walk across it. The point of that story is that faith involves both our trust and our action. It isn't sitting back and waiting for God to act. It's taking the initiative and making things happen, as did the old Jewish couple in the legend today. This is such an important truth that I'd like to illustrate it with another story that makes the same point, but from a slightly different perspective. It's a story we've used before, and I know you've heard it before. I've used it before so many times, but it fits so well with what we're saying that it deserves repeating today. One spring, a terrible flood engulfed a rural area. It stranded an old woman in her house. As the woman stood out on the front porch, a man in a boat appeared and said, "I've come to save you." "No thanks," said the woman. "I trust God completely. If worse comes to worse, He'll save me." The next day, the water rose to the second floor. And as the woman stood at her bedroom window again, a man in a boat appeared and said, "I've come to save you." "No thanks," said the woman. "I trust God completely. If worse comes to worse, He'll save me." The next day, the water rose to the roof, and as the woman sat on the roof, a man appeared in a helicopter and said, "I've come to save you." "No thanks," said the woman. "I trust God completely. If worse comes to worse, He'll save me." The next day, the flood covered the house and the woman drowned. When she got to heaven, she said to St. Peter, "Before I go inside, I want to register a complaint." You know what's coming. "I trusted that God would save me from the flood, but He let me down." And Peter gave the woman a puzzled look and said, "I don't know what more the Lord could have done for you. He sent you 2 boats and a helicopter." Today's gospel stresses the important truth that God doesn't treat us like puppets. He treats us like partners. In other words, we shouldn't sit idly by and expect God to pull some string to save us every time we got into a jam. Or to put it another way, God doesn't want us merely to sit and trust. He also wants us to roll up our sleeves and work. He expects us to trust and to work. And this is the message, I think, of today's gospel. And so, if peace is to come to our world, if the hungry among us are to be fed, if the homeless among us are to be housed, if the naked among us are to be clothed, if families are to be places of love, if our children are to grow up wholesome, we must do more than turn to God in prayer and trust. We must roll up our sleeves and work. In other words, God has given us all the ordinary resources we need for daily living. Only when those ordinary resources fall short should we turn to God for miracles. And then we must do so with aggressiveness, as did the woman in today's gospel. In short, the message of today's gospel comes down to this. We should trust as if everything depended on God, but work and be aggressive as if everything depended on us. Amen.